Hello and welcome to the channel. I'm Andy, I'm a psychologist by trade, and I work with essentially common mental health disorders, so anything from depression to PTSD and anything kind of in between that. My background is also in neuropsychology, so essentially how your brain works, and I use this platform to help people to understand more about how their mental health works. So if this sounds like the kind of thing that would be useful and interesting to you, then please subscribe and leave me a comment if there's anything you'd want to see a video on going forwards as well. With today's video, I really wanted to focus on burnout and essentially how it's interacting with society as a whole at the moment, because I do feel like there's a really large missing element in the dialogue publicly at the moment around the mental health of society as a whole, rather than just on an individual level, and that might be interacting with all of these quirks that we're noticing. If you do follow the news, either in the UK or in America, or I'm sure anywhere else, there's a lot of things going on at the moment that seem a little bit, let's just say, unhinged compared to how things may have been 10 years ago, 20 years ago, so on and so on and so on. And I do feel like a lot of them are symptoms of the collective zeitgeist of society going through a bit of a mental health crisis. So if we think about burnout, the reason I wanted to focus on burnout for today is because there is a saying that's floating around online. It comes and goes in waves of we're in essentially a burnout society. Everyone seems to be feeling fatigued. Everyone seems to be feeling strained or pushed beyond their limit consistently. And this may be because of things like, I know in America there's a strong hustle culture in the younger generations where you feel like you need to hold 3 jobs down in order to afford to live at the end of the day. I know there's a crisis in the UK, for example, around cost of living and how that's impacting people feeling like they're working loads and loads of hours and not really having anything to show for it at the end of the day, and having loads of daily stressors as well on top of that. And I really wanted to focus on how this is impacting us, essentially. So what is burnout, how it's impacting us, what kind of changes it might be causing, and how that might transgress from an individual level through to a societal level. So some of this will be, well, most of this is based on evidence. Some of how it might be applying to society as a whole, this is going to be more based on observation and a general understanding of psychology, because as far as I'm aware, there just isn't really much research out there on this kind of a subject as well. So if we think about what burnout is, essentially at face value, burnout can present a lot like feeling depressed. So it's usually associated with a strong sensation of tiredness. It's usually associated with a kind of mental fog or like a physical fog. So you're feeling really fatigued, you're feeling like your body is slowing down, it's just not as responsive as it should be. Same with your mind, you might struggle to concentrate or think clearly or even remember things in your day-to-day life. There can be lots and lots of different problems that come up there. And you may find that you're just really, really craving sleep a lot. So you may feel really, really tired. You may even have disturbed sleep. It's really common for people with burnout to want to sleep more and more, but they just can't really fully relax, or they have real trouble fully relaxing enough to fall asleep properly. Same with appetite. You may have appetite disturbances. You might eat a lot less. You might go through binge periods where you eat a lot more and then you don't really eat very much for a while, and then you go through another kind of binge after a while. There's loads and loads of different symptoms there, but one of the things I do think is really important is if you were to look up the diagnostic criteria for depression and burnout, they really do overlap. They are essentially, as far as diagnostic criteria, they are essentially the same thing. All of those symptoms I've just described, I've missed 1 or 2 of them, but generally there's 9 symptoms of depression if you look at the DSM-5, which is one of the common ways that we diagnose depression. There's 9 diagnostic criteria in there. Burnout really matches up with all of those, if not all of them. And of those 9 criteria, I've essentially mentioned 7 of them so far. There's a couple that I won't mention just for YouTube reasons, but yeah, essentially that. Um, so those are the symptoms that you may experience if you are burned out. But where do these come from? They don't really come overnight. So they're not something that you're going to notice, okay, day one, I'm great. Day two, I'm really severely burned out. It is also something that happens gradually and it escalates as well. So if you were to look up guides online on burnout, there's something like 5 stages to burnout, where it's essentially talking about a progressive escalation of burnout symptoms over time as well. So the reason for why these symptoms come up, I think, is actually best explained through a model that's quite commonly used to explain what depression is. So we know that burnout is a response to stress, and we know that it's a progressive thing, so that suggests that it's a response to progressive stress overload. So high stress that isn't going away despite what we do, and no matter how much we keep turning up to work day by day by day by day, how much of our workload we get through, how many things we achieve, for one reason or another, that stress isn't going away. So this might be immediately moving from one deadline to another deadline. It might be being in a culture where you're managing several projects at once. As soon as you finish one project, you've still got 2 more that you need to jump onto immediately, for example. It might be other factors in work, so working really long hours or working in jobs that are very resource intensive. So that could be physically intensive work, that could be very mentally intensive work as well. Generally speaking, most people only have about a couple of good hard hours worth of mental work in them per day. So when I say that, I mean working at your kind of maximum capacity mentally. Most people can only sustain that for about an hour or 2 per day before they exhaust themselves. So you can think of it like 80% of your kind of mental capacity or higher, you can sustain that for about that long. You can work at, let's say, sort of half capacity or kind of autopilot all day, but we can only sustain that high intensity mental load for a certain period of time before we run out of that capability. So we might be finding that this is coming on from work. It's usually most commonly caused by work, where we are just constantly getting some form of stress, maybe over a prolonged period of time. And initially, when we would start a new job or start a new project in work, we may find that we go through a period of feeling really motivated. We feel really energized. We feel really ready to go. And this is really, really common, and it makes sense in the model, because when we go through a stress response, what our body will do is it will burn through our internal resources faster, whether that's physical resources, so making sure our muscles have all of the fuel that they need. It could also be mental resources as well. So mental resources would be things like serotonin, dopamine, cortisol, anything that your brain would use as essentially a chemical messenger. You will be waking up each day with a certain amount of serotonin, dopamine, so on and so on in your brain that your brain can use throughout the day. If you are going through a period of stress, you will burn through those resources faster, which essentially means that you're going to get tired quicker by the end of the day. So you may, if you have a really hard day at work, you get home, you may crash straight away, for example, or you may start to feel some of the symptoms of being kind of tired and teasy more towards the end of the day, feeling a bit more snappy, feeling a bit more emotionally dysregulated towards the end of the day, because your mind is starting to run out of those resources if you were to keep the normal routine in that kind of scenario. Now, generally, for the first few weeks, you may find you're elevated, you're energized, you're ready to go, everything's great. You might feel a little bit more tired in the evenings, but generally, everything's really, really good when you're at work. Then, over the course of a few weeks, few months, so on and so on, you may start to find that you start to hit a bit of a wall where you're starting to withdraw from things outside of work. Maybe you're not really enjoying things as much. Maybe you're feeling too tired to do things outside of work. Maybe you're even feeling too tired to keep up with your work in general. Maybe you're starting to have a cheeky nap in your lunch break or things like that, feeling like you're constantly needing to kind of catch up or re-regulate yourself in some way. And this is usually a sign that essentially your body is starting to get near its limit, or you have hit your limit as far as that energy reserve goes. You're starting to run out of it. So the way that you can think of this is your body will get to a point, if you have sustained stress, where essentially you will be burning through those reserves quicker than your body can essentially synthesize new resources for you. So when you hit that point, your body's reaction is to generally go into kind of a depressive style response, actually. So this is why this model is associated with depression, because in an evolutionary basis, the idea of depression is it's a response where we're withdrawing from everything, we're shutting down, we're conserving our energy, we're not really going to be motivated if we're depressed. We tend to withdraw from lots of different things. We're more likely to call in sick to work, for example, if we're feeling really low that day, or withdraw from big problems that we might have going on. So if you're working on a kind of personal project, for example, you start to feel low, you pull away from it, you shut down for a bit. And in the short term, pulling away, shutting down could arguably be a useful response. Again, like most of these internal responses that we have, our body is trying to help us to survive. We wouldn't generally have these responses if they weren't theoretically helpful on some level. So in the short term, our body will want to pull away, it will want to shut down, it will want to rest and rebuild its energy. And generally speaking, having a break from everything, if we are burned out, is one of the better ways of dealing with it. Doing the opposite of that, keep pushing through burnout, is not going to make you any better. You do need to rest and allow your body to catch up at some point, whether that's having a full break from work or whether that's reducing your workload for a bit until you feel like you're recuperated a little bit as well. But generally, because most of us can't really afford to take a lot of time off work, especially if it is burnout related. Burnout, depending on the level of burnout, we might feel better after a week off, we might need a full month off, we might need even longer than that before we start to feel like we're really ourselves again, depending on how severe the level is. So we can't really necessarily afford to do that all the time, which means we keep pushing through it. And if we push through it, the situation isn't going to get any better, generally speaking. But what does change is our perception of the problem. So this is where we might hit the later stages of burnout, where it's called habitual burnout. Habitual burnout is where we get so used to feeling rubbish that essentially we stop realizing how rubbish we feel, to cut a long story short. So yeah, we're still feeling tired all the time. Yeah, we're still feeling mentally foggy all the time. Yeah, we're still feeling like we can't sleep all the time or things like that. But we stop noticing that. That just becomes our normal. And once we get to this stage, it can be really hard to catch the burnout and deal with it. We just, usually by this stage, we start to feel like maybe it's me as a person. Maybe I'm just not very good at things anymore. Maybe I'm just not really up to the task anymore. Maybe I'm getting older and I'm losing it a little bit, for example. All of those kinds of factors may come up. So once we reach this stage, it can be really, really hard to catch the problem, recognize the problem, and get out of the problem as well. Because usually once we hit habitual burnout, then the time that we're going to need off to actually really fully recover from that is going to be much longer. Now, what kind of impacts might this have on us as an individual and also as a society? Well, number one, if we're underslept and if we're experiencing mental fog, if we're experiencing all of these different kinds of problems, then firstly, our cognitive ability, so our thoughts and our ability to use logical reasoning or things like that, they're going to be greatly diminished, which means in simplistic terms, our IQ is realistically probably going to be lower than it actually would be normally. So essentially, you could think of it as like we've got some kind of interference with our intelligence level. It's going to be harder for us to problem solve. It's going to be harder for us to jump to conclusions. It might be really simple problems feel really overwhelming to us as well, because our mental faculties just aren't like they should be there. The other thing is stress-related illnesses. So there is a big epidemic around stress-related illnesses, whether this is heart-related problems, whether this is other factors as well. So IBS is considered stress-related a lot of the time. A lot of digestive problems or bowel problems can be strongly associated with stress because our stomach is essentially strongly impacted by the amount of stress that we feel. So we may even notice that's our main problem. We might find, I just really never feel like my stomach is quite right, but I don't feel stressed. I don't feel burned out. I'm not really picking up on that, but I am noticing my stomach is consistently bad, or my IBS is really out of control, or things like that. So once we hit that habitual point, it may even be the case that that's really more of what we notice rather than the other things. It may even be that we go through periods. So in people that experience panic attacks, for example, we quite often find, or I would say at least half, if not 3/4 of the people who I work with who experience panic attacks, they will make a comment somewhere down the lines of, it just feels like it's from 0 to 100. I just feel like I'm fine 1 minute, and then the next minute, it's just full panic attack, feels like it came out of the blue. It might be triggered by nothing that I've noticed. It might be triggered by something really, really minor. That's usually not the case, that you've just gone from 0 to 100 in a split second, stress-wise, in order to cause that panic attack. Usually what it would mean is you're probably not noticing the amount of stress that you're under on a day-to-day, and you're so close to the limit of your stress that it only takes a small thing to send you over that limit to the point where you can't manage it anymore. So that could be a sign of habitual burnout or habitually high stress, or there could be other factors as well, which I won't go into here, but it could be a factor worth considering if that feels like it's something that relates to you. It could even not be a burnout. It could be a panic attack even, sorry. It could be you feel like you go through a kind of mental breakdown where you start crying out of the blue, or things like that. That can be related to this as well. So lots of factors there. The other thing is, generally our health isn't going to look very good. So if we're not sleeping very well, our ability to replenish our mental resources is going to be impaired generally, because your brain goes through a regenerative process when you're asleep, and it will also process memories, it processes emotions, things like that when we're asleep. So your brain's ability to self-regulate and bring itself back to a good position is going to be impaired if your sleep isn't that great. If you're not eating as much, so if you've got an impaired appetite, or if you're binge eating and you're eating lots of junk food rather than eating proper meals or things like that, that's going to impair your body's ability to pull itself back as well. So in the long term, those by themselves could have health consequences for us as well. They're going to make us really, really stressed on a mental and a physical level, because everything's just going to feel that much harder as well. So when we start to think of things from this angle, we can start to think about, how is this impacting society as a whole? Well, generally speaking, I mean, if you spend any time looking at the news, there's an argument to be said that people appear to be more emotionally dysregulated at the moment, that people tend to feel more stressed. Burnout can lead to a sense of hopelessness, or a sense of essentially just not really feeling much emotion at all, like an emotional numbness as well. So more and more people may get to the point where they just feel like they don't care and they just check out of society, for example. I know there's a strong movement in more Eastern cultures around that stuff. I can't remember the exact name of it, but I think in China it translates to like laying down or something down those lines, if you wanted to look into it. where a lot of the younger generations are just saying, you know what, I don't want to spend all my life working just to feed the system, and that's it. They don't feel like they're getting a good deal out of that anymore. So there's lots and lots of different symptoms that you may start to notice, even within your own friends, even within your own group of people that you work with, stuff like that. If people are burned out as a society, it may incline us to being more granular. So people start withdrawing from each other in a general sense. So we spend more time indoors by ourselves, which is going to increase our sense of loneliness because we just don't feel like we've got the energy to go out and be social and talk to people. We might withdraw from sports, things like that. So again, like more of a sedentary lifestyle, all the health implications that come with that, which may mean, again, we're losing out on those day-to-day things that is going to give us a boost to our mood, a boost to our health, and also a way of managing stress. Sports is really, really good way of managing our stress overall. And if we don't feel like we've got the resources to engage with things like sports, then it's going to be really hard for us to use good stress coping strategies overall. So there's lots and lots of different ways that you may notice this. And also it could be as simple as people seeming like they've got a really short fuse, or it feels like people are jumping to conclusions about things a lot quicker than they normally would be, because if everyone is burned out, then everyone's going to find it a lot harder to think in the way that they normally would. They're going to find it a lot harder to regulate their emotions in the way that they normally would, because their brain and their body is running low on resources, essentially, in order to regulate themselves. It may be if someone's got chronic insomnia, then that could be because of that, and that can have loads and loads of different implications. I know that as a society, generally in the West, we do tend to prescribe a lot of sleep medications for better or worse. So I won't go into the research around sleep medications, but generally speaking, as a permanent solution, they're not great. To cut a long story short, some of them are arguably potentially effective. A lot of them are essentially working on placebo-style effects. So there are ways of improving your sleep, though, which we can definitely go into in a future video, but there's lots and lots of problems with the system as well. So, and also things like antidepressant prescriptions as well. A lot of people may go to their doctor describing these kinds of symptoms to their doctor, get prescribed antidepressants, which I'm not suggesting the doctor is doing anything wrong by doing that. They're following guidelines, they're following intuition. But at the same time, if we're prescribed antidepressants when the problem is actually burnout rather than, let's call it like a pure depression, that's going to encourage us to keep pushing through the problem. That means that we're going to keep pushing through things at work, and that may lead to us thinking that we feel better when we're actually starting to approach habitual burnout, for example. So it can be quite hard to distinguish these kinds of things because the symptoms are essentially exactly the same as well. And there's a big case to be said around that, around, is depression burnout, which there is an argument that it could be up to a point. Or is it that our understanding and our categorization of what is depression, is that good at the end of the day? Now, I think that the answer is a little bit of both. I think the symptoms that we look for to categorize depression are very badly generated. They're not really very specific. So they're very good at catching someone who feels terrible, but they're not very good at catching someone who is explicitly depressed, if that makes sense. So, and this is a major, major problem with diagnosing mental health problems in general as well. But quite often someone may flag on the depression measures if they're ill that week. If you get the flu, you may score over the threshold on a depression questionnaire, and questionnaires are the main way that we measure symptoms of depression, honestly, which has its own limitations. But yeah, essentially, if you have a really bad flu, there's a good chance that you could score above the threshold that we might suggest that you're depressed that week. Or if you've got a long-term health condition, so chronic pain or asthma or IBS or anything like that, the natural day-to-day problems that you may run into may tip you over the threshold where you might actually score on those questionnaires as being depressed, even though you may not be. It's just the fact that if you have chronic pain, you might be more tired, or you might have difficulty sleeping, or things like that as well. That leads us on to another point. So we've touched on the idea that, generally speaking, burnout can lead to certain kinds of health issues, generally stress-related health issues. If you've already got health issues, though, burnout can definitely escalate them. So to give you a really, really strong and prominent example in my life, I'm asthmatic. Generally, asthma can be very influenced by stress. So if you're burned out, you're essentially going through quite an extreme stress response. That can make things like asthma feel way more out of control than they otherwise would. If you've got chronic pain, then the links between pain and stress are really, really, really well researched. And generally speaking, people who are more stressed, who are more burned out, who are feeling more low, you will experience the same pain more intensely. So when I say this, what I mean is, objectively, you may have a 5 out of 10 level of pain. So objectively, this is how much pain you're in. If you're feeling happy and you're feeling really, really good, you would rate that pain subjectively as lower than the objective amount. So you may have 5 out of 10, but you would feel it as a 3 out of 10, if that makes sense. If you're more stressed, more low, burned out, anything like that, you're going to rate it more intensely than that. You're going to rate it as maybe a 7 out of 10. And there's a few different reasons for that. So one of them may be, as part of that stress response, you might be holding a lot of tension that can interact with musculoskeletal pain, potentially. If you've injured your shoulder and you're tensing your shoulder up all the time, that's going to put a lot of strain on that joint. That's going to flare up the injury, for example. The other thing is, when it comes to, and this is a whole topic in and of itself, this would be a whole half hour or so video in and of itself, is when it comes to the mental processes around pain. So when we are more burned out, we tend to have more of a negative focus on things as well. We're going to have more of a negative bias in how we interpret things. And what this can mean is that we can essentially become more, the short version when it comes to chronic pain is we're more bothered by that pain than we otherwise might be. We might hyper-focus on it more, or we might start to catastrophize about that pain, like, oh, I'm going to feel this way forever, or it's never going to get better, or things like that. We might dwell on those kinds of thoughts a lot more, which is going to cause us to experience that pain more if we're focusing on it more, for example. So we've got those kinds of factors. This negative bias as well, we could apply this essentially to a broader perspective as well. So this could be rates of depression across society. If everyone's burned out, which leads to a negative bias, or partially burned out leading to a negative bias, people are going to find it much harder to feel positive emotions, for example. So you may find it harder to feel happy. You may find it harder to fully relax or be around your friends or stuff like that without feeling like you're kind of pessimistic about things. You feel like you're always looking on the negative side of life, or you're starting to catastrophize, or things like that, which can in and of itself fuel anxiety as well. If you are an anxious person, then we know that if you're burned out, then your mental faculties aren't going to really be up to snuff in the same way that they normally would be, which means it's going to be much harder to deal with your anxiety, to rationalize those anxious thoughts, things like that. So the anxiety is going to feel a lot more potentially volatile than it otherwise would be, because it's just harder for us to regulate ourselves. And again, this, we are noticing, for one reason or another, mental health difficulties across society are rising. And part of this may be around having more open dialogue around mental health issues, which I don't necessarily think is a bad thing completely. I think there's some issues that come with that, but to maybe give a brief explanation of that, I think that awareness of mental health problems is increasing societally. People are talking about it more, but understanding isn't increasing. People are talking about it more, but they don't quite really know what they're talking about. And that can lead to a lot of misinterpretations or misinformation getting out there, which is one of the reasons why I'm creating this channel. So, yeah, essentially, there is a spike in mental health problems. I think it's multifactorial. I don't think it's just burnout related, but it makes a lot of sense when we start to think about it this way. So, and how this might interact with all of those kinds of factors. So, if you feel like you're struggling with burnout, if you feel like it's something that you recognize in yourself, you want to work on, generally the broad advice would be have a break, whether that's booking annual leave, whether that's taking some time out, calling in sick, anything like that that you feel like you need to do. Generally speaking, that would be step one of managing burnout. And any break is a good break as well. So it doesn't have to be too long. If you can't do a full week off or anything like that, any break is a good break. The other thing would be trying to ensure that you get the resources that you need into your body. So if you are struggling with your appetite, can you make sure that you're at least getting some form of nutrition into you? If you're struggling with your sleep, can you start to work on your sleep? So I will do a full video on this. Sleep is quite a complicated subject when you really get into it, but as a quick suggestion for some information that you might find, if you were to go onto Google and type in get self-help sleep hygiene, that will take you to a website or a PDF that will give you some quick ideas and tips that might help you there. Other things that can help with burnout is making sure that the kinds of things you're trying to do, there is some level of balance between them. So generally speaking, if we do nothing but work, we're going to burn ourselves out. If we do nothing but pleasurable activities, so fun things, hobbies, interests, seeing friends, in theory, that should make us feel really good, but we're not going to meet our needs financially or anything like that if we're doing nothing but fun stuff. So we need to make sure there's a bit of a balance between them. We also need to balance things like keeping on top of the house as well. If we're not keeping on top of the house, so dishes, clothes, shopping, all of that stuff, that's going to make us feel more stressed. So it could be just having a bit of a think about how you're approaching the week. Can you spread things out a little bit more? Make sure you're doing something that's fun a little bit more often. Maybe even think about how you're doing that fun thing as well to make it work with your energy levels. So if you are feeling really low on energy, can you do less of that thing? So let's say you might be into computer games, you normally game for a couple of hours. Can you do half an hour without it pushing you too far? Do you have the energy to do it for half an hour? The other thing might be engaging in it in a different way. So it could be, okay, I do a sport, let's say I do martial arts, for example, and I don't have the energy yet to go and engage in martial arts. I don't have the energy right now to go and attend my local club or something like that. But what I could do is try and think, is there another way that I could engage with that? Could it be turning up, doing half a session, and then going home rather than doing the full session? So aiming for less to make it more sustainable. Could it be engaging in it in some other way? So, okay, I'm going to do some sports-based workout at home that's going to help me towards that, but I can pace myself according to whatever energy level I have. Could it be just reading about the subject, watching it on social media or things like that? There's loads and loads of different ways that you could engage in that thing, still get that boost from engaging in that thing, but not burning through all of your energy reserves in maybe the same way. Those are the general initial tips, but as I said, this is going to be a full video series, and there's lots of different angles I want to approach this idea of mental health in society as a whole going forward. So if you feel like this is helpful and you want to follow this discussion further, please subscribe, leave some comments as well, and we'll expand on these topics going forwards. There's definitely a lot more that I do want to talk about around these kinds of subjects as well, and getting good information out there as far as how you can help yourself. I feel like accessing good information around mental health that is based in the science, that is proven to work for people, is surprisingly difficult. So I do want to work on making sure this kind of information is more accessible to people via this channel going forwards. So anyway, if you've gotten this far, thank you for watching. Have a good rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.